there's a major union strike affecting the shipping ports on the east coast of America as of yesterday, and the implications of this strike on the economy and your wallet could be huge.
Everything in the United States comes on a ship. Guys who sell cars can't sell cars because the cars ain't coming in off the ships. Malls start closing down. They can't get the goods from China. They can't sell clothes. They can't do this. They're gonna be like this. In today's world, I'll cripple you.
So do you guys remember during the pandemic we had all those supply chain disruptions because the ports were closed? Well, container ships got stuck at sea famously for a few months while they waited for spots to open at the dock, and we saw overall price increases across many sectors as businesses would pass their higher costs to consumers. In fact, the supply chain disruptions were one of the main contributing factors to the rapid rise of inflation that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. And history seems to be repeating, and not in a good way, because as of yesterday, October 1st, the East and Gulf Coast ports are on strike with approximately 50,000 union longshoremen walking off the job. Now, to some of you guys, this may not seem like a big deal. In the US media cycle, there always seems to be some sort of labor strike or labor dispute going on, but this strike is especially dangerous because of, quote, this. Between 43% and 49% of all US imports and billions of dollars in trade monthly move through the US East Coast and Gulf ports. And with that many goods moving through these ports, the economy is going to be vastly affected the longer that this strike drags on. So today I'll help you understand what is happening, what is going to be affected in the economy, what may happen in the coming weeks and months, and how it will affect you. So batten down the hatches, my friends, and let's discuss. All right, so the International Longshoremen Union is having a dispute with the United States Maritime Alliance. So on one side, you have the union workers, those that actually work on the docks, and on the other side, you have the organization that represents all the big global shipping companies, like Maersk, for example, is one of the largest shipping and logistic companies that is part of the U.S. Maritime Alliance, USMX. Now, the International Longshoremen Union is seeking to secure two things for their union members. Number one is a total ban on automation on things like cranes, grates, and moving containers in the loading and unloading of freight. The threat of automation plays a huge role in this labor dispute, as it does for many other industries that rely on human labor. Now, if these shipping companies start to employ automation, this could erode the number of jobs available for hardworking American laborers. And number two, the union is also trying to secure, of course, higher wages. Quote, the current ILA contract has union members making a range of $20 to $37 an hour, according to previous CNBC reporting. Depending on seniority, skill rate, hazard pay, overtime differential, plus tonnage bonus, which can be anywhere between $15,000 to $20,000 a year, a longshoreman can make between $150K to $250,000 annually. Now that quote was a little bit conflicting, at least when I read it, because on one hand it says they make between $20 to $37 an hour, which is the equivalent of $40,000 to $74,000 a year. But then it says with hazard pay, overtime, and all these other sorts of extra billing that they might have, that they could make between $150,000 to $250,000 per year. I personally had a hard time finding the true salary range that they make, so if you are part of the ILA union, perhaps you can comment below. But what you do need to know is that they don't feel like they're making enough money. As of Monday, the USMX offered a nearly 50% wage hike over 6 years, but that was rejected by the ILA according to a source close to negotiations. So a 50% wage increase won't do it, and the negotiations are again at a stalemate. The ILA union leader, Harold Daggett, meanwhile said that the union is pushing for a 61.5% pay increase according to CNBC. And in one clip, he says he's just looking for a $5 per hour wage increase across the board.
I'm looking for $5 across the board for 6 years, and I'm going to fight for it because those greedy companies are making billions of dollars and they don't want to share. That's why we're out here now fighting for a contract. Nobody knew what the longshoremen were. We didn't get respected, but now we will. Now we will when they find out malls are going to shut down because goods can't come in. Yeah. Car salesmen are going to get laid off. Well, guess what? Everything that comes in this country comes from the containers off these ships.
And he's not wrong. The strike currently impacts about half of the ports in America, and it means that every single day that the ports aren't operational could cost the U.S. economy anywhere from several $100 million to $4.5 billion a day, according to analysts and business groups. Now, the last time the ILA went on strike was back in 1977. It only lasted about 4 months, but it caused massive disruption across the country. Goods piled up at the ports, and businesses struggled struggled to get their products on the shelves, and the economy took a very big hit, and yes, many of the prices of goods went up. Now, that was 50 years ago, and trade is much more globalized today than it was back then, meaning that a strike of this magnitude won't just have an impact on us in the United States, but it could also have a huge global economic impact, so I think the stakes are even higher. So what are some of the major players that are going to be affected the longer that this strike drags on, and what does this mean for you? So here's a list of the top US importing companies at the 14 major ports that the strike is impacting, and we can see that Walmart leads the list here with 47,700 TEUs imported at the East and Gulf Coast ports. Now, a TEU is basically an acronym for a 20-foot equivalent unit, and that basically means one container. Now, other companies leading the list include IKEA, Samsung, Bob's Furniture, and LG, as well as automakers like Hyundai and GM. They both have a lot of exposure to this port strike. So the most significant industries to be affected are going to be your food, your automobile, and even the pharmaceutical industries, according to experts. So let's talk about food first. The ILA imports about 1.2 metric tons of bananas, with Port Wilmington as the main banana distribution hub, and the striking ports manage about 25% of the bananas Americans consume. So if the strike isn't resolved in a timely fashion, bananas could get more expensive, as well as other specialty foods like imported chocolate, as well as cherries. Your local liquor store could also feel the effects of the strike, since, quote, 18% of the beer consumed in the US is imported, as is 25 to 33% of wine, as well as 90% of rum. And many of these imports come through the East and Gulf Coast ports. In terms of cars, Cox Automotive has actually reported that new vehicle supply is back to pre-pandemic levels. Quote, in the near term, consumers and dealers would feel little impact from an ILA strike, according to an executive analyst at Cox. However, right now there's a healthy supply of cars that will last about 60 to 90 days or 2 to 3 months. That means if the strike goes longer than a few months, we could see prices surge again. But one thing that is also a concern to me is that the parts are often coming through these ports as well. Parts coming through these ports. That's a mouthful. But that means even if a car is missing just one critical part, it can't be finished or sold. All right, so now with pharmaceuticals, approximately 48% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, used in the US are being imported from India. Without these APIs, medications cannot be produced, and APIs are also manufactured in Europe, which also uses the East Coast ports as US points of entry. So hypothetically, this could affect some of the prescriptions you might get, but most of the headlines are usually focused on the weight loss drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. Not sure if I pronounced Wegovy right there. If you do know how to pronounce it, let me know down below. But still, I just wanted to let you know it's not a time to panic right now, but you still may want to stock up on some prescriptions you might need further down the line. Now, if the situation does get worse, the government can actually intervene with an act called Taft-Hartley, but I will explain that shortly after this next bit. I personally think that the biggest impact that this entire port strike will have is just straight up inflation across the board, because if the strike goes long enough, shippers have to divert goods to other more expensive ports or leave containers stranded. Analysts have been warning ocean spot rates could increase by 20 to 50%, and UBS forecasts that 20% of Maersk's total volume would touch a US port would be impacted by the strike. Maersk is on the board of USMX, as you may know, and UBS estimated that if freight rates increase 30% over 2 quarters, a revenue tailwind of more than $1 billion would be generated. So let me break this quote down a little bit because it's a little confusing. You would think that extra revenue generated for Maersk is a good thing, but that's actually not. Higher freight rates to Maersk is actually a bad thing because the extra rates are actually costs to the shippers. So that means the company shipping the goods will have to pay Maersk even more. So if the shippers are experiencing higher costs of freight, they are ultimately going to pass these costs down to, you guessed it, the consumer. This increase in costs broadly could cause the prices of goods to go up, which we all know is how inflation gets started. So if ocean spot rates increase by 20 to 50%, we could see the costs of this magnitude being passed down the supply chain all the way to the goods that we consume later down the line. Supply chain issues were a huge contributor to the inflation that we saw in many countries during the pandemic, and this is something that we hopefully want to avoid with this strike in particular. Okay, so I mentioned that one possible scenario is that the government might intervene, and that's the Taft-Hartley Act. Historically, when major labor disputes threaten the national economy, the federal government has sometimes stepped in to prevent or resolve strikes. This intervention usually comes in the form of invoking the Taft-Hartley Taft-Hartley Act, and this was actually an act passed after World War II in 1947. It basically allows the government to intervene in certain strikes that could have a significant impact on the economy or national security. One of the provisions is that it allows the president to invoke an 80-day cooling off period. During this time, the strike or lockout is paused for up to 80 days, and it's at this time both parties are encouraged to negotiate even more and resolve any differences. If the 80 days passes and nothing is resolved, workers can legally resume their strike again. Now, this has only been invoked a couple of times in history. Once it was used for a dock worker strike in 1971 and also in a railroad strike in 1950. However, it's important to note that the Biden administration has actually drawn a firm line in the sand about not intervening with the strike, saying, quote, "We've never invoked the Taft-Hartley Act to break a strike, and we're not considering doing so now." Still though, I found it fascinating that if things do get too rough, we could see the government stepping in, and I could also imagine that if you're a dock worker and you're forced to work again because the government uses this act, you might not be that enthused or that productive if that were to happen. So the big takeaway here is that many of the goods that we buy on a daily basis could be affected the longer that this strike goes on. If we were to see supply chain disruptions past 1 or 2 months, we could see further inflation as early as 2025, which dramatically would hurt the chances of the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates further. I don't think it's the exact time right now to panic or hoard any goods or medicines you might need. Hopefully this strike gets resolved, but it's definitely a story that we need to keep an eye on because the implications that it has not only on our pockets, but the global economy can be huge. If you have any comments about the situation, please let us know down below. And as always, I plan to keep you guys informed here on YouTube or in my newsletter Hump Days. That comes out twice per week and is completely free to sign up. I will leave a link to it down below in the description. If you're interested in one of my best videos on the channel that goes over practical personal finance tips, you'll want to check out my 21 money lessons video that I'll leave right here. And I'll see you guys in that video or a future one on this channel. Thank you for watching. Peace.